Imagine yourself in the quiet, drafty hall of a small, stone manor in the late 14th century. The walls are damp, the flickering torchlight casting slow shadows that creep along the rough-hewn timbers. Outside, the winter wind rattles the shutters, carrying the faint smell of smoke and the sharper tang of frozen earth. Today, you are not merely an observer, you are present at one of the most important moments in a person's life, the negotiation of a marriage contract. Medieval marriages were not simple affairs of affection and choice. The union of two people was first and foremost a contract, a legal and social instrument that linked families, secured alliances, and often ensured survival. The people entering into these contracts were not just individuals, they were representatives of households, estates, and sometimes kingdoms. It might seem dull to modern ears, but understanding these hidden rituals is key to understanding why medieval weddings could be so brutal. The process begins long before any ring is exchanged or any feast prepared. In a small village or a sprawling estate, a family looking to marry off a daughter or a son, though the historical record skews toward daughters, would first seek a suitable match. Suitability was determined by wealth, social standing, and political advantage. Beauty and temperament might be considered, but only inasmuch as they reinforced the family status. Every detail mattered: the size of a dowry, the distribution of property, and even the reputation for fertility or survival. The negotiation itself could last weeks, sometimes months. Families would send representatives, often legal experts or trusted retainers, to discuss the terms. These discussions were conducted with the utmost seriousness, often over a slow series of visits. Each word, each gesture, was recorded in memory, because once a contract was agreed upon, it would rarely be broken without consequences. One of the most overlooked yet fascinating aspects of these contracts was the ritualistic nature of their formation. While the documents themselves were straightforward, listing the dowry, property, and obligations, the surrounding ceremonies were elaborate. A father might present his daughter, formally dressed in a simple but dignified gown, to the prospective groom and his family. The girl herself had little say, often standing silently as men argued over her future. This presentation was a public acknowledgement. The family's intentions were now a matter of record in the eyes of both the local community and the church. The church played a crucial role in these proceedings. Canon law governed marriage, emphasizing the binding nature of consent, but here, consent was a complicated matter. A girl might be asked if she agreed to marry, yet her yes was typically influenced by her father's authority. The ritual often included the exchange of symbolic gifts: a knife, a ring, a piece of cloth, each with a long-standing meaning. The knife symbolized protection, the ring represented fidelity, and the cloth was a token of domestic duty. These tokens were not merely decorative, they were legal markers, evidence of the agreement that could later be cited in disputes. Dowries, of course, were central to the marriage contract. They were not simply gifts, they were investments, security deposits against the uncertain future of the bride. Families calculated them meticulously, sometimes over generations. A dowry could include land, livestock, money, or goods such as linens, spices, or jewelry. For the bride's family, it was a way to ensure their daughter's well-being. For the grooms, it was a guarantee of economic advantage. Negotiations over dowries could be tense, particularly when land was involved. Entire estates could hinge on the precise valuation of a dowry, and disagreement occasionally erupted into violent confrontations between households. Beyond the negotiation, there were legal formalities that might seem tedious today but were profoundly serious in the medieval world. Contracts were often sealed with wax and signed with marks or signatures, sometimes in the presence of witnesses whose social status lent authority to the agreement. Each witness had a distinct role. Some observed the exchange of gifts, some verified the family's consent, and some recorded the details for future legal use. In many ways, the negotiation of a marriage contract was a trial in miniature, a test of familial, social, and legal competence. One particularly fascinating ritual involved the troth-plighting ceremony. This was the formal promise between the bride and groom to marry. Unlike the modern engagement, it was legally binding in its own right, a spoken vow that could not easily be broken. Families would often stage this ceremony in the local church, with clergy reciting the vows and community members observing in silence. The bride and groom might exchange rings or hold hands across a cloth draped between them, symbolizing both unity and separation. The union was sanctioned, but the bride remained under her family's authority until the final wedding. These ceremonies were sometimes punctuated by more curious rituals. In some regions, Brides were required to kneel or be lifted onto a horse in a symbolic act of submission. In others, the couple might drink from a shared cup of wine or milk, a gesture intended to unite their fortunes and ensure fertility. These actions seem trivial or strange to us today, but they were laden with meaning and followed centuries of tradition. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a careful balancing act between public display, legal obligation, and personal survival. One must also consider the social pressure surrounding these contracts. Families lived in close-knit communities where gossip and reputation mattered greatly. A poorly arranged marriage could ruin a family's social standing, while a well-negotiated match could elevate them. This constant scrutiny created a subtle but persistent tension. Any misstep, any perceived slight could have consequences not just for the bride and groom, but for entire lineages. For the young bride, these negotiations could be particularly taxing. Though her voice was rarely the final word, she was acutely aware of the weight of her family's expectations. Some girls accepted their fate quietly, while others tried to influence negotiation through small gestures, careful expressions, or appeals to sympathetic relatives. In rare cases, brides attempted to escape unwanted matches entirely, though success was limited and often dangerous. Even after the contract was sealed, the story did not end. The period between betrothal and marriage could last years, particularly among the nobility. During this time, the bride might live with her family, receiving instruction in domestic skills, religion, and social etiquette. She would also be the subject of scrutiny. Her conduct, her appearance, her education all mattered in the long-term success of the match. The groom's family might send emissaries to observe, ensuring the bride met their expectations before the final union. It is tempting to think of these processes as merely bureaucratic, but they were deeply entwined with the very fabric of medieval life. Each ritual, each negotiation, each token of consent carried immense weight. They were the mechanisms by which families secured their futures, protected their assets, and maintained their honor. And yet, behind this facade of ceremony and law, one can detect the quiet, often unspoken anxieties. Fear that the bride or groom might fall ill, that property might be lost, or that alliances might fail. These fears were rarely discussed openly, but they shaped every decision and every ritual. As the day's negotiations drew to a close, the family might retire to a quiet hall, discussing the next steps in hushed tones. The bride, often removed from these conversations, would reflect on the uncertainty of her coming life. She would ponder the strange objects she had handled: the knife, the ring, the cloth, and the invisible bonds they represented. Each was a reminder of her new role, a symbol of both protection and constraint. The ceremony might have concluded, the contracts signed, and yet a profound question remained. Would these carefully orchestrated agreements bring the security and prosperity promised, or would they lay the foundation for conflict, disappointment, and, in some cases, outright violence? It is this question, the uncertainty beneath the formalities, that begins to reveal why medieval weddings were not merely celebrations, but events fraught with potential peril. The meticulous care given to the contracts, the rituals, and the negotiations was not just a matter of tradition, it was a survival strategy in a world where fortunes, reputations, and even lives could be lost through a single misstep. The bride's journey and the family's fortunes hung precariously on the fragile threads of agreement and expectation. And so, as the torches gutter and the shadows lengthen across the hall, one cannot help but wonder, beneath the wax seals and ceremonial gifts, how often did these contracts truly secure happiness? And how often did they ignite conflicts that would endure for decades? After the contracts were signed and the formalities concluded, the next phase of the medieval marriage process unfolded. The preparation, the anticipation, and the delicate balancing of social, economic, and familial pressures. While Section 1 introduced you to the seemingly mundane but critical rituals of contract making, Section 2 will take you deeper into the daily realities, the anxieties, and the hidden struggles that accompany these unions long before the first dance or the first kiss. For many families, the period between betrothal and the eventual wedding was a time of cautious planning. This interlude could last months, or even years, especially among the nobility, who used the time to consolidate wealth, prepare estates, and solidify alliances. In the countryside, for peasants, this waiting period was equally significant but far less formal. A peasant family might have only a small parcel of land, a few animals, and a modest household to manage. Even in such humble circumstances, negotiations over what the bride would bring into the marriage, the dowry, the goods, the practical contributions, were matters of survival. In noble households, the bride's education became a carefully managed program. Girls learned reading and writing if their social class permitted, though their primary instruction focused on household management, textile work, and the rituals of hospitality. They were trained to oversee servants, manage storerooms, and prepare for the precise execution of feasts and ceremonies. This education was not leisurely. It was rigorous, structured, and closely observed by matrons and governesses who reported back to the father or the head of the household. Any deviation or laziness could be interpreted as a failure to uphold family honor, potentially jeopardizing the marriage or diminishing the bride's perceived value. Meanwhile, the groom's family was not idle. Observers might visit the prospective bride, noting her comportment, her etiquette, and even her physical appearance. Reports were often sent back to the groom's father or advisors, who would weigh each observation against the contractual promises. In some cases, these visits became tense, as families discreetly maneuvered to adjust terms, demand additional dowry items, or challenge perceived inadequacies. A simple comment on a bride's complexion or bearing could spark hours of negotiation, or leave lasting tension between households. Even in families of modest means, careful observation and strategy were vital. A peasant girl might be praised for her industriousness or discouraged if she displayed laziness. The prospective groom's family wanted evidence that she could contribute to household labor, manage small plots of land, and maintain domestic routine. That could literally determine the survival of a family through harsh winters. The stakes were not abstract. They were concrete, measured in calories, firewood, and livestock. During this waiting period, tension was compounded by the pervasive influence of superstition and social expectation. Families consulted local clerics, wise women, and sometimes astrologers to determine the best time for the wedding. Certain days were believed to bring misfortune, others prosperity. Even minor details, like the color of the bride's attire during a betrothal ceremony, could be thought to influence the marriage's success. These beliefs, while seemingly trivial, carried weight. In a world where disease, famine, and sudden death were common, people grasped at any semblance of control, even if it came in the form of symbolic gestures. The interplay between law, ritual, and everyday life created a delicate tension. Medieval marriage contracts were not abstract legal documents. They were living agreements that required constant attention. Dowries had to be safeguarded. Promises about inheritance had to be tracked carefully. Gifts exchanged during betrothal had to be preserved. In some cases, disputes arose over minor items, a chest of linens, a cow, or a sum of money. Such disputes were not trivial. They could escalate to prolonged feuds with families, sending emissaries, petitions, or even armed retainers to assert claims. The potential for violence was ever present, a subtle undercurrent that permeated even the most ceremonious agreements. Among the nobility, historical records recount instances where disagreement over dowries or inheritances erupted into open skirmishes. Knights might be dispatched, disputes were brought before local courts, and alliances were tested. A poorly handled negotiation could turn a wedding into a flashpoint for local conflict. For peasant families, the stakes were different, but no less real. Disputes over land or livestock could result in economic ruin, exile from the community, or forced remarriage under unfavorable conditions. Another significant aspect was the preparation for the trousseau, the collection of clothing, linens, and personal items that the bride would bring to her new household. This process could take months of careful labor. In wealthy families, the trousseau might include finely woven tapestries, embroidered garments, and precious textiles. Every stitch was scrutinized for quality, and mistakes were sometimes interpreted as carelessness or disrespect toward the groom's family. In peasant households, the trousseau might be modest but equally important. A few sets of durable clothing, a collection of well-tended household tools, and perhaps small hand-woven textiles. Here too, these items represented practical survival and the family's reputation for industriousness. During this period, young brides also faced the psychological and emotional strain of waiting. They were acutely aware of the expectations placed upon them, yet they often had little control over their own lives. Letters from cousins, older siblings, or sympathetic family members sometimes offered guidance or comfort, but such support was scarce. In some noble families, young women were allowed to correspond with their future husbands under supervision, a practice intended to establish familiarity and trust. In reality, these letters were often carefully scripted, leaving little room for genuine expression. The groom himself, meanwhile, experienced his own pressures. He might be required to demonstrate his ability to maintain a household, manage lands, or assert his social position. His actions during visits, feasts, or discussions with the bride's family were scrutinized for maturity, reliability, and temperament. In this way, the waiting period became a form of prolonged assessment for both parties. The eventual wedding was not merely a celebration, it was the culmination of months, sometimes years, of careful observation, negotiation, and social maneuvering. All of these preparations converged in a way that few modern observers could fully appreciate. The meticulous care devoted to contracts, treasures, dowries, and rituals was not mere bureaucracy, it was a survival strategy in a world where a single misstep could result in loss of fortune, honor, or life. Families expended enormous effort to control as many variables as possible, yet uncertainty always remained. Illness, accidents, and unforeseen circumstances could render months of planning meaningless. Even the most careful agreements offered no guarantees that the marriage would bring happiness or stability. And so, as the day of the wedding drew nearer, families and communities alike held their collective breath. Every detail mattered: the timing, the gifts, the ritual gestures, and the human behavior that might be beyond control. The tension was subtle, quiet, but pervasive. One could almost hear in the hushed conversations of matrons the meticulous sorting of trousseau items and the measured steps of the bride as she rehearsed her manners and gestures. This phase of preparation highlights a crucial truth. Medieval weddings were brutal, not merely in physical terms, but in psychological and social dimensions. The bride, the groom, and their families were subject to pressures that tested endurance, patience, and careful judgment. The rituals, though outwardly ceremonial, were mechanisms for managing risk and asserting control over uncertain futures. Each act, each token, each carefully worded clause carried weight beyond its immediate appearance, shaping destinies in subtle but profound ways. As the final days approached, the questions that haunted families, brides and grooms alike remain. Would the meticulously planned agreements withstand the unpredictable realities of life? Would the bride's labor, her preparation, and her compliance secure her household's survival? And perhaps most pressing of all, would the formalities, the gifts, and the contracts ultimately prevent disaster, or merely postpone the inevitable tensions and conflicts that lurked beneath the surface of these carefully arranged unions? The long months of negotiation, preparation, and anticipation culminated at last in the wedding day, a day that promised celebration but often delivered tension, exhaustion, and sometimes outright peril. Imagine the scene: the morning light filtering weakly through narrow windows, illuminating a hall where servants scurry to arrange the trousseau, lay out fine cloths, and prepare food. In the air is a mixture of burning tallow, damp stone, and the faint scent of newly laundered linens. The bride sits quietly, her hands clasped, rehearsing gestures and words she has practiced for months. Her family moves around her, attending to last-minute instructions, checking gifts, and whispering reminders of protocol. The ceremony itself was a delicate choreography designed to balance public spectacle, religious authority, and legal validation. In noble families, the wedding might begin at the local church where clergy oversaw the vows, the exchange of rings, and the symbolic acts that confirmed consent. The bride and groom stood before a congregation of relatives, retainers, and neighbors, each person's presence reinforcing the social weight of the marriage. In this setting, even a small misstep, a stumble, a delayed response, or an awkward gesture could be remembered for years, interpreted as a sign of impropriety or lack of virtue. The exchange of gifts and the presentation of dowry items remained central to the proceedings. A chest of linens was carefully inspected, coins or jewelry were counted, livestock or land deeds were formally acknowledged. The bride's family sought to ensure that all obligations had been fulfilled, while the groom's household verified that the promised benefits would soon enrich their estate. Despite the ceremonial nature, these actions carried the tension of potential dispute. A misplaced item, an undervalued dowry, or even a miscommunication could ignite anger, shame, or resentment. Feasts followed the ceremony, often elaborate and labor-intensive. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pies, cheeses, bread, and spiced drinks. Servants moved swiftly, clearing dishes, replenishing supplies, and attending to the guests' every need. Yet beneath the festive surface, subtle hierarchies and rivalries persisted. Seating arrangements reflected social rank, and a minor insult, an overlooked guest, or an improperly served dish could create lasting friction. Even laughter and conversation were carefully monitored, as every action was observed and remembered. Despite these outwardly celebratory aspects, the day was physically and emotionally demanding, particularly for the bride. She endured hours of standing, kneeling, and walking, all while maintaining the appearance of grace and composure. Her garments were often heavy, layered, and restrictive, making movement difficult. Jewelry, veils, and ceremonial accessories added further burden. The sensory overload, the heat of crowded halls, the noise of feasting and conversation, and the constant scrutiny contributed to exhaustion that was both literal and psychological. After the public ceremonies came the private consummation, a stage that was legally and socially significant. Canon law emphasized the necessity of consummation to finalize a marriage, and families often maintained strict oversight, though the level of privacy varied widely by class and circumstance. In some cases, the bride might be guided or instructed by older women in the household on her duties and expectations. Even this intimate aspect of marriage was imbued with ritual and social meaning, reinforcing her new role within the husband's household and marking the transition from daughter to wife. The aftermath of the wedding often revealed just how precarious the carefully constructed contracts could be. Disputes over dowries or property sometimes emerged immediately, despite months or years of preparation. Perhaps a chest of linens was found lacking, a promised sum of money delayed, or a piece of land contested. These disputes could range from minor quarrels resolved quietly within family to public confrontations, appeals to local courts, or even violence. Historical accounts describe incidents in which minor disagreements at a wedding feast escalated into brawls, duels, or prolonged family feuds. Illness and injury were another harsh reality. The close quarters, heavy garments, and crowded celebrations could exacerbate pre-existing conditions or lead to exhaustion. In winter months, travel to and from the ceremony often brought exposure to cold, wet weather, increasing the risk of respiratory infection. Accidents, such as falls from horses, mishandled cooking fires, or structural failures in halls, were not uncommon. For a bride, these dangers were amplified by her role in navigating spaces, managing rituals, and performing duties that might seem mundane but required constant attention and physical effort. Social expectations continued to press upon the newlyweds long after the wedding day itself. The bride's integration into her husband's household demanded careful negotiation of relationships with servants, extended family members, and even tenants or local villagers. Her ability to manage these relationships, maintain domestic order, and fulfill economic obligations could determine her long-term survival and influence. The groom, too, faced pressures to assert authority, manage estates, and uphold family honor. The honeymoon period, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. Instead, the immediate post-wedding period was one of intense labor, observation, and social maneuvering. In some unfortunate cases, the tensions, rivalries, and unmet expectations inherent in these marriages led to outright violence. Historical records recount instances of brides fleeing their homes, husbands attempting to annul unions forcibly, or families engaging in prolonged feuds over property and honor. The very contracts designed to prevent conflict could, ironically, serve as flashpoints for it. The legal weight of the agreements made disputes more rigid, and the failure to meet obligations could spark social condemnation or retaliatory action. Yet, despite these brutal realities, medieval marriages were also the foundation of survival and continuity. Families relied on them to secure land, consolidate power, and ensure the passing of wealth and titles. The rituals, ceremonies, and contracts, however tedious or taxing, were essential mechanisms for negotiating a world defined by uncertainty, scarcity, and social hierarchy. In this sense, the apparent brutality of medieval weddings was not merely cruelty or indifference. It was a reflection of the high stakes of life in a society where honor, property, and survival were inseparably linked. As the dust settled from the ceremonies, the feasts, and the first nights of married life, families might finally breathe. Yet, even then, questions lingered. Would the promises of the contract hold true over the years? Would alliances remain intact? Or would subtle grievances fester into open conflict? Could the newlyweds navigate the complex web of social expectations, family pressures, and practical responsibility to build a household that survived and perhaps even thrived in a precarious medieval world? In the quiet moments, after the hall emptied and the candles burned low, one might reflect on the resilience required to endure these rituals. The endurance demanded of young brides and grooms, and the subtle forms of brutality hidden within every carefully planned ceremony. Medieval weddings, with all their formalities and minutiae, were not merely celebrations of union. They were tests of patience, strength, and adaptability. And in understanding these hidden pressures, you glimpse a deeper truth about medieval life: that survival, honor, and prosperity were not guaranteed, but precariously negotiated through ritual, law, and relentless attention to detail. It is this realization of the hidden challenges, the enduring anxieties, and the quiet resilience required to navigate them that illuminates why medieval weddings were far more than mere social gatherings. They were microcosms of a world in which every gesture, every token, and every agreement carried the weight of survival itself. In the dim morning light of a 15th century manor, you might witness a scene that seems mundane at first glance, a family seated around a wooden table, paper spread before them, ink-stained quills in hand, and coins, cloth, and jewelry arranged meticulously for inspection. This is the world of dowries and dowries, a landscape where wealth, honor, and survival intersected in ways that could make or break families. To understand the brutal reality of medieval weddings, one must understand the central role these financial arrangements played in both forging alliances and igniting conflict. A dowry was not a gift. It was a carefully calculated contribution from a bride's family to the new household she would join, meant to ensure her comfort and secure the family's influence over the marriage. The dowry could consist of money, land, livestock, valuable goods, or a combination of all three. Each component was negotiated with precision, often over weeks or months, with both sides assessing the value of what was offered and what would be expected in return. A miscalculated dowry could have consequences far beyond embarrassment. It could destabilize the financial health of both households. Consider, for instance, a noblewoman whose dowry included a portion of her family's farmland. The land itself might be productive, but its valuation could become a source of intense dispute. How fertile was the soil? Were the boundaries well defined? Could the new owner truly rely on rents or produce as expected? Every question mattered because property represented tangible security. In a world without insurance, social safety nets, or banks, the successful transfer of wealth through a dowry could literally determine the survival of a household for years to come. Dowries, on the other hand, were the provision made for the bride's support in the event that she outlived her husband. Unlike the dowry, which was provided before or during marriage, the dower was often secured by law or customary practice to ensure a widow's protection. It could consist of lands, income from rents, or movable wealth, and it was legally binding. A dower could become a point of contention during marriage negotiations, particularly when multiple heirs or complex inheritance arrangements were involved. If mismanaged, disputes over dowries and dowries could escalate into family feuds, court battles, or even acts of violence. Negotiating these arrangements required both diplomacy and cunning. Families employed agents, lawyers, or trusted representatives to advocate for favorable terms. Contracts were drawn up meticulously, listing each item, sum, and obligation. The exact wording mattered, for legal and social enforcement depended upon it. One poorly phrased clause could later be interpreted to the disadvantage of one party, potentially igniting a long-lasting conflict. And because the agreements were public, in many cases witnessed by neighbors, clerics, and local officials, any perceived slight could damage family honor, making precision essential. The bride herself, though rarely given ultimate authority over the dowry, was nonetheless intimately connected to its implications. Her comfort, social standing, and security were tied directly to the adequacy of the dowry. In some cases, families went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that dowries were impressive. Lavish textiles, fine jewelry, or even imported goods might be included to signal wealth and status. In other families, careful thrift dictated that every coin and object be accounted for, balancing generosity with necessity. The tension of these calculations could be intense, especially when resources were limited or when multiple children required dowries simultaneously. Dowry disputes could also be more subtle and psychological. If a dowry was considered insufficient, it might cast doubt on the bride's value or her family's reputation. Conversely, an overly generous dowry might place burdens on the groom's family, leading to resentment or suspicion. In extreme cases, families attempted to manipulate dowries to influence marriages, with promises exaggerated or deliberately understated to achieve a strategic advantage. Such manipulations could be uncovered only after the marriage, sometimes resulting in bitter recrimination. Beyond the financial dimension, dowries and dowries were entangled with the social and political fabric of the time. In noble families, marriages were strategic tools for consolidating power, forging alliances, and securing territorial claims. A carefully negotiated dowry could strengthen claims to land, reinforce fealty between vassals, or settle disputes between rival factions. The stakes were high. A poorly negotiated dowry could weaken alliances, invite challenges from rivals, or even provoke conflict. In peasant communities, dowries were equally significant, though on a smaller scale. They ensured the practical survival of a couple in a harsh and unpredictable environment, providing tools, livestock, and provisions necessary to sustain daily life. Even the ceremonial aspects of dowry exchange carried weight. Items were presented formally, often with witnesses observing and recording the transfer. In some regions, specific rituals were performed. Coins might be counted aloud, textile inspected meticulously, and livestock driven ceremoniously into the groom's holdings. These acts were not merely symbolic, they were legal evidence, ensuring that obligations were recognized and enforceable. Any deviation, whether intentional or accidental, could provoke disputes or accusations of bad faith. The risks of mismanagement or disagreement extended well beyond the wedding day. Historical records reveal numerous cases in which dowry disputes persisted for decades, sometimes long after the original bride and groom had passed away. Lands reverted to original families, sums of money were reclaimed through court action, and rival heirs contested inherited goods. In some situations, families resorted to intimidation, coercion, or outright violence to enforce claims. For the bride, these conflicts could be deeply destabilizing, undermining the security that the dowry was supposed to provide and placing her in precarious social or financial positions. This tense environment gave rise to strategies and behaviors designed to protect interests. Families monitored their investments carefully, recording every coin, every cow, and every piece of fabric. Marriages were often accompanied by detailed inventories, written in legal language and witnessed by multiple parties. Agents might be dispatched to inspect properties, verify the condition of goods, or confirm delivery. In some cases, brides themselves were required to participate in these inspections, demonstrating competence, diligence, and obedience. Failure to comply could be interpreted as negligence, with serious consequences. Even when all preparations were meticulously observed, uncertainty remained. Crop failures, disease, death, or political upheaval could render even the most carefully calculated dowry ineffective. Families had to navigate these uncertainties, balancing ambition with pragmatism, generosity with caution. The negotiations, legal instruments, and rituals surrounding dowry were attempts to impose order on a world defined by unpredictability, yet, no matter how careful, the planning risk could never be entirely eliminated. By the time the wedding day arrived, the accumulation of effort, attention, and anxiety around the dowry could weigh heavily on everyone involved. The bride's family might be consumed by hope and fear, anxious to see their daughter settled but wary of disputes or insult. The groom's family might scrutinize every detail, ready to assert rights or challenge deficiencies. For the couple themselves, the dowry was both a bridge and a burden, a tangible expression of value, obligation, and expectation, shaping their lives before the first words of the ceremony were even spoken. And so, as you imagine the candles flickering in the hall, the wax seals on contracts, and the meticulous counting of coins and cloth, you sense the quiet, relentless tension that defined these arrangements. Dowries and dowries were not simply financial transactions. They were instruments of power, survival, and control. They created a world in which even seemingly mundane decisions carried weighty consequences, where small mistakes could escalate into ruin, and where the future of households rested upon careful negotiation, observation, and endurance. Yet, despite all this preparation and care, the question lingers: how often did these carefully calculated dowries prevent conflict, and how often did they merely postpone the inevitable disputes that would follow the wedding? Could wealth and planning truly secure a peaceful union, or were they simply a veneer over the more brutal realities of medieval life? The days and weeks leading up to a medieval wedding were filled with a subtle tension that few modern observers can fully appreciate. For families negotiating dowries, each conversation, each exchange, each inspection carried the weight of survival, status, and honor. While Section 1 introduced you to the financial and ceremonial importance of dowries and dowries, this section delves into the complex negotiations and the social pressure that made these arrangements so precarious and, in some cases, dangerously volatile. For wealthy families, the negotiation of a dowry was a strategic process, almost akin to a diplomatic mission. Families dispatched emissaries, trusted servants, clerks, or legal advisors to the prospective groom's household. These agents were skilled in arithmetic, rhetoric, and social maneuvering, trained to advocate for their family's interests while avoiding offense. The stakes were high. Undervaluing a dowry could reflect poorly on the family, while overvaluing it could create resentment or financial strain for the groom's household. Each negotiation required careful calibration, a balance between assertiveness and diplomacy. In some cases, negotiation extended beyond the immediate transaction of goods or money. Families would leverage political alliances, previous favors, or claims to land to secure favorable terms. A nobleman might remind a prospective father-in-law of past military service, a long-standing friendship, or mutual obligations to strengthen his position. Conversely, a bride's family could demand concessions in exchange for granting a more substantial dowry, such as rights to property management, control over specific lands, or influence over household decisions. These negotiations were rarely simple, and tensions often simmered beneath the polite veneer of civility. Disputes over dowries could be subtle, psychological, and prolonged. Even when both families appeared to agree, small disagreements could escalate. For instance, if a chest of linens was found lacking, faded, torn, or of inferior quality, it could trigger formal complaints, demands for additional compensation, or threats to halt the marriage entirely. Likewise, if promised sums of money were delayed or mismanaged, trust between the families could erode, creating a ripple of anxiety and resentment. Every action, gesture, and statement carried potential consequences, because the negotiation process was as much about perception as it was about material wealth. The bride herself was often acutely aware of these pressures, even if her influence over the negotiation was limited. In some cases, she could appeal to sympathetic relatives, offer counsel about practical matters, or demonstrate her competence in managing domestic resources. Such involvement could enhance her standing, but it also carried risks. A misjudged comment or overstepping her perceived role could be interpreted as impertinence, undermining both her position and her family's leverage. In rare instances, young brides employed subtle forms of negotiation, used charm, tact, or carefully chosen words to sway decisions in their favor. Among the peasantry, the dynamics were different but no less fraught. Dowries often included essential items for survival, livestock, farming tools, or stored grains. A poorly prepared dowry could jeopardize the couple's immediate livelihood, leading to disputes not just between families, but within the local community. Villagers, neighbors, and extended kin sometimes acted as informal arbiters, witnessing the exchange and ensuring fairness. In tight-knit communities, any misstep could carry social consequences, affecting the family's reputation and relationships for years to come. One particularly perilous aspect of dowry negotiations involved legal and political complexities. In noble families, land grants often carried overlapping claims, ambiguous boundaries, or pre-existing obligations. Mismanagement could invite legal challenges or provoke rival claims. Historical records reveal cases where disputes over dowry lands escalated into armed confrontations, sometimes drawing entire villages or retinues into conflict. In these situations, a wedding which was intended to cement alliances could paradoxically become the flashpoint for violence, feuds, and protracted litigation. Even when disputes did not escalate to outright conflict, the constant surveillance, inspection, and negotiation created an environment of relentless pressure. Families meticulously recorded every item, counting coins, verifying livestock, and tracking property. Every gesture during the exchange was scrutinized, from the careful presentation of textiles to the ceremonial placement of gifts. Mistakes, whether accidental or intentional, could be interpreted as bad faith, dishonesty, or disrespect, potentially jeopardizing not just the marriage, but the family's social standing and influence. Dowries also carried a symbolic weight that extended beyond their material value. They represented the bride's worth, her family's honor, and the seriousness of the union. A carefully prepared dowry demonstrated diligence, foresight, and respect. A poorly managed one signaled negligence, poverty, or dishonor. Families understood that perception mattered as much as reality. A slight could be remembered for years, shaping alliances, reputation, and even future negotiations for siblings or relatives. In some regions, dowry disputes became the domain of formal legal institutions. Courts might be convened to resolve disagreements over land, livestock, or monetary obligation. Lawyers and clerics intervened, interpreting contracts, verifying records, and offering rulings. Even minor errors could result in protracted hearings, requiring family to invest time, energy, and resources to defend their claims. For women, particularly brides, these legal disputes were fraught with danger. Without the protection of influential relatives or allies, they could be left vulnerable to manipulation, coercion, or outright loss of promised resources. Amid all this complexity, families developed strategies to mitigate risk. Legal experts drafted highly detailed contracts, often exceeding dozens of pages, specifying the exact quantity, quality, and delivery method of each dowry item. Witnesses were carefully chosen for their social standing and reliability. Gifts and property were inventoried repeatedly, and the bride's participation was sometimes required to confirm accountability. These measures, while tedious, were designed to create a clear record and prevent disputes, or at least to provide the necessary evidence should disagreements arise. Yet even the most meticulous planning could not eliminate uncertainty. Disease, death, political upheaval, or natural disaster could render months of negotiation meaningless. Families had to operate under constant awareness that despite their best efforts, risk remained. Every decision carried weight, every oversight could have consequences, and every transaction required vigilance. This reality created a psychological and social tension that permeated the day and weeks before the wedding, shaping behavior, communication, and expectation. It is here, in this delicate dance of negotiation, surveillance, and calculation, that the brutality of medieval weddings becomes clearer. The danger was not merely physical, it was social, legal, and psychological. Families navigated a landscape where honor, survival, and prosperity were inextricably linked, and where a single misstep could have repercussions that endured for decades. Young brides, grooms, and their families were constantly negotiating not only material wealth, but trust, reputation, and the precarious balance of power. As the wedding day drew closer, one cannot help but ask, even with all the careful planning, legal contracts, and strategic maneuvering, how often did dowry negotiations actually succeed in preventing conflict? And in cases where they did not, how did these disputes ripple through generations, shaping the social, economic, and even political landscape of medieval communities? At last, the day arrived. The air was filled with the scent of burning tallow, fresh hay, and the faint tang of livestock brought in for feasting or ceremonial presentation. In the halls of both the bride's and groom's households, servants scurried, candles were lit, and precious items were arranged with meticulous care. The dowry meticulously negotiated, itemized, and sometimes contested over weeks or months was displayed with a precise sense of ceremony. Every coin, piece of cloth, and gift carried more than material value. Each was a tangible symbol of the bride's family's honor and the groom's household's expectation. The bride, often dressed in layered gowns of heavy fabric, adorned with jewelry that had been included in the dowry, prepared herself for the day with a combination of nervous anticipation and rigid composure. She was acutely aware that every gesture, every movement, and every glance would be scrutinized by the groom, his family, and the assembled witnesses. Even slight errors, a mislaid piece of cloth, a missed bow, or a fumbled token could be remembered for years, interpreted as a sign of incompetence, laziness, or disrespect. Ceremonies in noble households often began with a formal procession to the church or local chapel. Clerics oversaw the exchange of vows, the presentation of gifts, and the affirmation of consent. Dowries were inspected carefully, counted, and sometimes even tested. Linen were examined for quality, coins for authenticity, and livestock for health. Each act of inspection, though ostensibly ceremonial, carried a quiet intensity. The verification of material wealth was inseparable from social and legal obligation. Mistakes or omissions could ignite disputes, sometimes immediately, sometimes months later, as families sought to assert claims or reclaim property. Feasts followed the formal proceedings, transforming the household into a stage for social hierarchy and observation. Guests were seated according to rank, meals were distributed with careful attention, and every movement of servants was monitored. The dowry itself often became a topic of subtle commentary. The quality of items displayed, manner of presentation, and even the apparent satisfaction of both families were scrutinized. For the bride, this event was exhausting. She navigated conversations, observed decorum, and maintained composure under the weight of expectation and social pressure. Despite outward appearances of celebration, danger lurked in multiple forms. A minor error in the presentation of the dowry could provoke verbal confrontation or social embarrassment. Disputes over livestock or money sometimes erupted into physical altercation, with retainers or allies of the families intervening. Historical records reveal instances in which disagreements over dowries escalated to violence, and in rare cases, even to armed skirmishes involving multiple households. Weddings, designed to unite families, could paradoxically become a flashpoint for conflict when obligations were questioned or perceived to be unmet. Even in more modest households, the stakes were high. Peasant dowries, livestock, farming tools, or stored grain were critical to the couple's immediate survival. Any defect or mismanagement could compromise the household, forcing young couples to negotiate delicate compromises, endure embarrassment, or contend with the judgment of neighbors. The act of presenting the dowry in a public or semi-public setting ensured accountability, but it also amplified the potential for conflict, humiliation, or social censure. The consummation of the marriage, required by canon law for its legal and spiritual validation, added another layer of pressure. In many households, the bride was guided by older women or matrons on her responsibilities and expectations. The dowry, still present in the background, was a reminder that the marriage was not just a personal union, but a contractual and economic obligation. The bride's ability to fulfill her role and manage household responsibilities was scrutinized as much as her compliance with the ceremonial aspects of marriage. Post-wedding disputes over dowries were surprisingly common. Even when contracts were detailed and meticulously observed, unforeseen complications arose. A cow might die, a sum of money could be delayed, or property boundaries might be challenged. Families sometimes brought claims to local courts or ecclesiastical authorities, resulting in protracted legal battles. In certain cases, these disputes persisted for decades, affecting inheritance, reputation, and familial relationships. The dowry, which had been intended to secure harmony and stability, could inadvertently create tension, resentment, and conflict that outlived the original wedding. The psychological weight of these pressures was considerable. Families invested enormous energy in preparation and negotiation, yet none could guarantee outcomes. The bride and groom had to navigate social expectations, financial obligations, and family politics, all while establishing a household that would endure through economic uncertainty, disease, and political instability. Survival and prosperity depended on competence, endurance, and often sheer luck. Yet, amid these brutal realities, there were moments of quiet triumph. Successful navigation of dowry negotiations and wedding ceremonies could secure financial stability, strengthen alliances, and elevate family standing. A well-executed dowry exchange could cement relationships, demonstrate competence, and enhance reputation. For the bride, it could mean access to resources, security, and the social capital necessary to manage a household effectively. For families, it represented continuity, survival, and influence within their community. The complexity and intensity of these arrangements reveal why medieval weddings were so often described as brutal. The danger was not only in physical hardship or ceremonial discomfort, but in the legal, social, and psychological demands placed upon all involved. Every item in a dowry, every clause in a contract, and every gesture during a wedding day had the potential to influence survival, reputation, and honor. The meticulous preparation, observation, and negotiation were a form of endurance in a world where stakes were exceptionally high. In retrospect, the brutal reality of dowry negotiations underscores a broader truth about medieval life. Survival and prosperity were inseparably linked to careful planning, attention to detail, and an ability to navigate complex social networks. The wedding, the dowry, and the ceremonies were microcosms of a society in which every decision carried weight, every misstep could have consequences, and every individual, especially young brides, was tested in both subtle and overt ways. And so, as the last candle flickered in the hall and the guests departed, the question lingered: did the carefully negotiated dowry secure the peace and prosperity it promised, or did it merely postpone the inevitable tensions that would arise from human ambition, miscommunication, and unforeseen circumstance? In a world defined by precariousness, even the most meticulously prepared weddings carried the potential for conflict, revealing that medieval marriage was not merely a social contract but a high-stakes negotiation with consequences that could echo for generations. The morning of a medieval wedding feast often began long before the sun crested the horizon, with the air heavy with the scent of baking bread, roasting meats, and the tang of tallow from burning candles. While today we might imagine a wedding feast as purely celebratory, in medieval time it was a carefully choreographed display of wealth, social hierarchy, and obligation. Every dish, every seat, every cup of wine carried significance, and the pressures of the feast extended far beyond mere nourishment. Feasts were central to the social fabric of medieval marriage, functioning both as celebration and as public verification of alliances. A noble family's wedding feast could involve hundreds of guests, relatives, neighbors, retainers, and dignitaries from surrounding regions. Peasant weddings, though smaller, were no less demanding. Each guest had to be fed, served appropriately, and entertained, lest perceived neglect cause offense or harm the family's reputation. Food was distributed with strict attention to hierarchy. Those of higher status were seated prominently, served first, and presented with the choicest portion. Missteps in seating or serving could spark tension, subtle resentment, or even outright conflict. The preparation of the feast itself was an exercise in endurance and coordination. Servants labored for days, sometimes weeks, preparing the venue, baking bread, roasting animals, brewing ale, and assembling decoration. Kitchens were hot, crowded, and dangerous, filled with sharp knives, boiling liquids, and open flames. Spilled sauce or dropped bread could delay service. Overcooked meat could provoke complaint. Missing ingredients could require last-minute improvisation. For the bride, groom, and their families, overseeing these preparations added to a constant mental and emotional strain, as every detail was a reflection of household competence and social standing. Entertainment at the feast was another crucial element, but it carried its own pressures. Minstrels, jesters, and performers were often employed to amuse guests, and their performances were carefully timed to maintain attention, demonstrate sophistication, and underscore wealth. In some noble households, tournaments, mock battles, or dances accompanied the feast. Every performance, whether musical, dramatic, or athletic, was a reminder of the household's resources, status, and taste. Failures in presentation could embarrass families or diminish perceived prestige. The spectacle was exhausting to organize and demanded constant vigilance from hosts and their attendants. The feasting ritual itself was far from relaxed. Guests observed strict etiquette regarding the handling of food and drink. The wrong gesture, the improper way of passing a dish, or even slurping a stew incorrectly could be interpreted as disrespectful. Servers, often moving swiftly through crowded halls, were responsible for maintaining order while ensuring that every guest received attention according to rank. For the bride, navigating these ceremonies required composure, awareness, and stamina. She was expected to participate gracefully, acknowledge gifts and honors, and maintain decorum despite the physical and mental fatigue imposed by hours of standing, walking, and observing the feast. Alcohol consumption, particularly wine and ale, added another layer of complexity. While intended to encourage merriment, it could also exacerbate tension. Overindulgence among guests sometimes resulted in quarrels, arguments over precedence, or even physical altercations. For hosts, controlling the atmosphere required careful observation and subtle intervention. The social hierarchy had to be maintained, reputations preserved, and conflict diffused before they escalated into something far more serious. The food itself often reflected both abundance and symbolism. Roasted meats, pies filled with game, spiced fruits, and elaborate pastries were not merely nourishment but markers of wealth and prestige. Certain ingredients, like imported spices or sugar, were particularly prized, signaling connections, status, and the household's ability to procure rare goods. Presentation mattered as much as taste. A carefully arranged platter could impress guests and reinforce social standing, while a haphazard display could provoke comment or diminish the family's perceived competence. Even the smaller details were laden with significance. The color of tablecloths, the type of dishes used, and the sequence, of course, were carefully considered to reflect status, tradition, and propriety. Ceremonial toasts, public acknowledgements of dowry contributions, and the order in which gifts were presented reinforced the underlying social contract. Every element of the feast was a performance, requiring meticulous preparation, careful timing, and continuous oversight. Yet, amid all this careful planning, fatigue was inevitable. Days of preparation, combined with the anxiety of hosting hundreds of guests, took a physical and emotional toll. The bride, already burdened by layers of clothing, ceremonial jewelry, and social expectation, was forced to endure the pressures of etiquette, observation, and constant engagement. The groom faced similar demands, though with slightly more latitude. Servants, meanwhile, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, moving through the hallways, kitchens, and storage areas, ensuring that the feast proceeded smoothly despite potential hazards and mishaps. Even in smaller, rural communities, the challenges of the wedding feast were substantial. Peasant households relied on collective effort. Neighbors, relatives, and extended kin contributed food, labor, and entertainment. Coordination was essential, and any failure could lead to social embarrassment or strained relationships. A poorly prepared feast might provoke gossip, diminish the perceived worth of the bride or groom, or even create friction within the village. In communities where reputation and mutual support were vital for survival, these failures could have long-lasting consequences. Amid the spectacle and strain, the psychological dimension of the wedding feast was profound. Guests evaluated competence, status, and honor. Families negotiated alliances silently through observation and commentary. The bride and groom were constantly aware that their performance, their ability to manage stress, maintain composure, and navigate the intricate social web would be remembered long after the feast ended. This invisible pressure created a subtle but relentless form of brutality, testing endurance, patience, and resilience in ways that were easy to overlook from a modern perspective. By the evening, when the candles burned low and the hall emptied, the work was far from over. Leftovers had to be stored, equipment cleaned, and provisions accounted for. Any oversight could result in conflict, waste, or criticism. Even the most successful feast left families exhausted, their bodies sore, their minds taxed, and their attention still required to manage the social and material fallout of the day. And yet, these feasts were also moments of joy, bonding, and cultural expression. They showcased ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the ability to orchestrate complex social rituals. For a brief time, they allowed communities to gather, celebrate, and affirm alliances. But beneath the surface, the strain, risk, and relentless attention to detail revealed a hidden truth. Medieval weddings were not merely festive gatherings, they were intense tests of endurance, strategy, and social acumen. As you imagine the flickering candlelight, the clatter of plates, and the careful choreography of guests and servants, one question remains. Even with careful preparation, could a family truly control every variable of the wedding feast, or did fatigue, human error, and unforeseen tensions inevitably turn celebration into subtle, lingering chaos? After the initial ceremonies and the grand display of wealth during the wedding feast, the underlying pressures did not dissipate. In fact, the evening often revealed the more complex and sometimes perilous social dynamics that medieval weddings created. While the feast celebrated union and abundance, they also became a testing ground for alliances, social competence, and family influence. These gatherings, layered with protocol, symbolism, and expectation, were a microcosm of medieval society itself, hierarchical, ritualistic, and fraught with tension. One of the primary sources of strain during wedding feasts was the delicate balancing of precedence and hierarchy. Medieval society was rigidly stratified, and seating arrangements, order of service, and even the distribution of food were governed by strict rules. Noble families, minor officials, local clergy, and retainers all had positions determined not only by rank, but also by the subtle networks of influence and obligation. An incorrectly seated guest could perceive insult. A perceived slight could damage alliances. The hosts had to anticipate and mitigate potential offenses while simultaneously ensuring that the bride and groom maintained their dignity and visibility within the social order. As the feast progressed, human behavior introduced unpredictability. Alcohol, though a staple of medieval hospitality, heightened tensions and sometimes led to disputes. A wealthy retainer might boast loudly of accomplishments or possessions, drawing envy or criticism from others. A neighbor might feel marginalized, prompting gossip or quiet resentment. In more extreme cases, disputes over precedence, seating, or gifts could escalate into verbal confrontations or minor scuffles. While violence was not the norm, the potential was ever present. Weddings, which were meant to unite households, could subtly expose fractures in alliances, revealing the fragility of social cohesion even amidst celebration. Food and presentation, too, carried unexpected pressures. The quality of dishes was scrutinized carefully, both for taste and symbolism. Spoiled meat, poorly cooked pies, or underwhelming beverages were not merely culinary disappointment. They were reflections on the household's competence, resources, and honor. In some recorded instances, minor mistakes in preparation or presentation led to heated argument among relatives, with accusations of negligence or mismanagement thrown across the hall. For the bride, groom, and their families, these events demanded a steady hand, calm demeanor, and constant awareness of both the immediate and long-term social implications. Beyond etiquette and hierarchy, feasts were opportunities for subtle negotiation and display of power. Guests often used the occasion to strengthen alliances, assert influence, or subtly challenge rivals. A strategically timed toast could signal loyalty, while a carefully chosen anecdote could underscore wealth or competence. Gifts were exchanged, not only between the couple and guests, but also between families, reinforcing obligations and demonstrating reciprocity. These interactions required skill, tact, and awareness. A poorly timed remark or an ignored guest could damage relationships, while adept social maneuvering could solidify bonds and enhance reputation. The psychological weight of managing the feast was immense. Servants and hosts were acutely aware that every misstep could have repercussions long after the event. Food spoilage, delays in service, or improper handling of guests could tarnish family honor and provoke disputes. Historical accounts reveal instances where minor misunderstandings during a feast spiraled into prolonged conflicts, as offended families sought restitution or public acknowledgement. Even small oversights, such as misplacing a gift or miscounting coins for distribution, could be remembered for years, influencing subsequent marriages, negotiations, and alliances. Fatigue amplified these pressures. The bride, often encumbered by heavy ceremonial dress and jewelry, had to navigate hours of social performance. Her movements, gestures, and responses were observed continuously. The groom, while less burdened by attire, was expected to project competence, authority, and control over the proceedings. Servants, already exhausted from days of preparation, worked under extreme physical strain, moving swiftly to serve guests, replace dishes, and maintain order. The combination of heat, noise, constant attention, and prolonged activity created a subtle, insidious form of brutality, exhaustion coupled with unrelenting social vigilance. In addition, Weddings could expose latent family tensions. Disputes over dowry fulfillment, inheritance rights, or prior grievances often surfaced during the feast, when observation and testimony were immediate and unavoidable. Some families used the occasion to assert claims, test alliances, or demonstrate dominance. A public correction, whispered criticism, or strategically pointed question could humiliate a rival or signal authority. Guests, aware of these dynamics, participated not only as observers but also as potential allies or witnesses, amplifying the stakes of every interaction. Even after the feast concluded, challenges persisted. Leftover food had to be distributed, supplies accounted for, and debts settled. In rural communities, neighbors' perceptions and social memory continued to shape relationships for months afterward. For noble households, chronicles and letters recorded the events, preserving evidence of generosity, competence, or mismanagement. A single poorly executed feast could ripple through social networks, affecting marriage, alliances, and inheritance negotiations long after the last candle had burned. Alcohol-fueled disputes, mismanaged service, or unanticipated shortages could turn an ostensibly joyful celebration into a source of embarrassment, resentment, or ongoing conflict. Historical records reveal feasts where arguments erupted over the seating of a cousin, the quality of wine, or the order in which gifts were acknowledged. Such disputes, while seemingly trivial to modern eyes, were entwined with honor, hierarchy, and the maintenance of social networks. Families understood that appearances mattered as much as reality. The perceived success or failure of a feast could influence reputation and power far beyond the wedding itself. Amid these pressures, moments of strategy and adaptation emerged. Hosts might rearrange seating, adjust service, or issue private apologies to diffuse tension. The bride and groom, despite exhaustion, were expected to demonstrate grace, tact, and diplomacy. Servants developed systems to manage flow, anticipate needs, and respond to crises quickly. These adaptive strategies reveal the hidden skill, endurance, and subtle intelligence required to navigate even a single wedding feast. Ultimately, medieval wedding feasts were more than celebrations. They were arenas of subtle power struggles, endurance, and social negotiation. They demanded attention to detail, awareness of hierarchy, and the ability to manage both human behavior and material logistics under conditions of fatigue and unpredictability. The apparent joy and spectacle masked a complex network of pressures, obligations, and risks that tested every participant, from bride and groom to servant and guest. And so, as the last notes of music faded and the hall emptied, one question persisted. Even with careful planning, vigilance, and strategic intervention, could a family ever fully control the dynamics of a wedding feast? Or was the combination of human unpredictability, hierarchy, and fatigue an inevitable source of subtle, lingering chaos? Once the wedding feast concluded and the last guest departed, the reality of what had transpired began to settle in. For hosts, servants, and the newlywed couple, the hall that had earlier thrummed with activity now echoed with silence, and the laborious work of preparation and orchestration had left physical and mental exhaustion in its wake. The aftermath of the feast revealed a different kind of challenge, one that was often less visible than the immediate pressure of ceremony but equally consequential: the lingering consequences of fatigue, social tension, and hierarchical judgment. For the bride and groom, the days following the feast were critical. They were expected to establish their household, manage resources, and demonstrate competence in ways that extended far beyond the immediate celebration. The skills displayed or failed to display during the feast became part of their social record. A well-executed event could bolster credibility and reputation, while mishandled elements could provoke whispers of incompetence, jealousy, or dishonor. Even minor lapses were remembered by guests, retold in neighboring households, and could shape relationships for years. The servants and organizers faced their own set of consequences. Kitchens and storage areas had to be cleaned, leftover food properly stored or distributed, and debts and obligations reconciled. Any mismanagement could lead to loss of trust, reprimand, or reassignment. Historical records show that in some cases, feasts left families embroiled in dispute over unpaid debts, misappropriated provisions, or miscounted inventories. The labor that seemed purely physical was in fact deeply intertwined with social accountability, and errors, even unintentional, could have lasting ramifications. Meanwhile, the social fabric that the feast sought to reinforce was often tested. Guests, particularly among the nobility, evaluated not only the hosts but also each other. Subtle competitions of prestige, displays of wealth, and interaction with the bride and groom shaped future alliances and rivalries. A mismanaged dish or an overlooked guest could have amplified effects, influencing marriage, negotiations for siblings, inheritance disputes, or local political alliances in some cases. Even a minor perceived insult at a wedding feast could reverberate for years, altering the dynamics of communities and families. Among peasant communities, the consequences were equally tangible, though expressed differently. A poorly managed feast could strain relations within the village, lead to gossip, or reduce the willingness of neighbors to assist with future labor or emergencies. Dowry disputes or mismanaged gifts, even minor ones, could compromise the couple's livelihood or social support network. In an era where survival depended heavily on communal cooperation, these tensions were far from trivial. They underscored the subtle, persistent pressure that medieval weddings exerted long after the public celebration ended. The psychological dimension of the feast's aftermath was significant. The bride, groom, and their families often experienced fatigue compounded by social anxiety. How had they been perceived? Had they demonstrated competence, generosity, and honor? Had they offended a guest or overlooked an obligation? Medieval society placed extraordinary importance on appearances, and the memory of a wedding feast, both positive and negative, persisted in social consciousness. Success and failure were measured not only in the quality of food or gifts, but in the social perceptions of those present. Unexpected consequences also emerged in practical terms. Ingredients that spoiled during preparation could lead to food shortages or illness, requiring careful management. Dowry items, improperly stored or accounted for, could provoke disputes. Even well-intentioned gestures, such as giving leftover gifts to attendants or neighbors, could be misinterpreted as favoritism or oversight. The web of obligations extended far beyond the initial celebration, make the aftermath of a feast as complex and challenging as the event itself. Yet there were moments of quiet triumph. Families that successfully orchestrated a feast, balancing logistics, hierarchy, and human behavior, enhanced their social capital, strengthened alliances, and demonstrated resilience. The bride and groom, if adept in managing both public performance and private logistics, could consolidate their household's reputation and set a precedent for effective management. Even the servants and organizers, whose labor was both grueling and largely invisible, gained recognition and trust, reinforcing their own standing within the household or community. The subtle brutality of medieval wedding feasts, however, remained clear. These events tested endurance, patience, social intelligence, and resilience. Success required navigating hierarchy, managing human behavior, preventing or mitigating conflict, and sustaining energy over long hours of physical and mental exertion. In an age without modern conveniences, these feasts were arenas of both display and endurance, demonstrating that celebration in the medieval period was inseparable from obligation, responsibility, and the ever-present potential for social or physical misstep. Moreover, the echoes of the feast extended into the long-term social landscape. Alliances could be strengthened or fractured, reputations enhanced or diminished, and disputes, subtle or overt, could persist for generations. Weddings were not isolated events. They were part of the ongoing social, economic, and political rhythms of medieval life. The care, attention, and vigilance required reflected the broader pressures of a society in which survival, honor, and prosperity depended on meticulous observation, strategic planning, and the ability to endure prolonged stress. As you imagine the aftermath, the quiet halls, the tired hands of servants, the lingering social judgments, the question arises: in a world where appearances, hierarchy, and social memory held such weight, could any wedding feast ever be fully successful? Or was subtle conflict, exhaustion, and tension an inevitable part of celebration? And if these pressures endured long after the last dish was cleared, what does that reveal about the lived reality of medieval life, where even joy was inseparably intertwined with endurance and obligation? The morning of a medieval wedding began long before the ceremony itself, especially for the bride. Unlike modern weddings, where preparation is often a personal ritual accompanied by leisurely moments and professional assistance, medieval bridal preparation was an elaborate, physically demanding, and socially loaded process. From personal hygiene to ceremonial attire, each step reflected the intersection of social expectation, religious obligation, and the unyielding demands of material culture. Personal hygiene, though rudimentary by modern standards, was a critical part of preparation. Bathing practices varied depending on region, wealth, and season. Wealthy brides might have access to large wooden tubs, hot water heated over hearths, and perfumed waters for cleansing. They were assisted by female attendants, sometimes numbering several, who managed bathing, hair care, and the application of scented oils. Even then, the process was far from comfortable. Water could be cold or inconsistently heated, and the sheer size of heavy tubs made balance precarious. For peasants, bathing was often limited to communal baths or outdoor streams, leaving bride to contend with environmental conditions, cold, and exposure to insects or dirt. In either case, the act of cleansing oneself was a laborious undertaking that required endurance, patience, and careful attention. Hair preparation added another layer of complexity. Long hair, a symbol of beauty, virtue, and status, required hours of combing, braiding, and styling. Noble brides might have their hair intricately arranged with ribbons, nets, or jewelry, each ornament carefully secured to prevent slippage during movement or ceremonial gestures. Mistakes in styling were not merely cosmetic. They could be interpreted as signs of carelessness, disrespect, or incompetence. For peasant brides, hair might be braided simply but still needed to be maintained to prevent tangling under heavy veils or ceremonial headdresses. Long hours of standing or sitting in rigid posture while attendants worked on hair added a subtle, cumulative physical strain. Clothing was perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of preparation. Brides were layered in garments designed to signify wealth, status, and propriety. Fabrics such as heavy wool, silk, or linen were common among the upper classes, while even peasant attire often involved multiple layers to demonstrate modesty and adherence to custom. Each garment was cumbersome, restrictive, and sometimes hot, especially when combined with jewelry, belts, and ceremonial accoutrements. Dresses often featured tight lacing, heavy hems, and multiple undergarments, which limited mobility and required assistance to don. The process demanded endurance. A bride might stand for hours, while attendants adjusted, pinned, and fastened every layer. Even minor discomfort could become magnified over time, as the combination of weight, heat, and restricted movement placed a continuous strain on body and mind. Veils and headdresses, essential symbols of modesty and social expectation, added further challenge. Elaborate constructions of cloth, wire, or fine lace were secured atop the hair, often extending down the back or covering the face partially. Maintaining balance and posture while wearing these items was a subtle test of physical control. A misaligned veil could slip, an ornament could detach, or movement could crease delicate fabric, potentially signaling negligence or incompetence to onlookers. The ceremonial importance of these items magnified the pressure. Failure to maintain them reflect not only on the bride but on her family, who bore responsibility for preparation. Footwear, rarely comfortable, added another layer of endurance. Medieval shoes were often tight, poorly fitted, or constructed from stiff leather. Walking long distances, traversing uneven floors, or navigating crowded halls in ceremonial footwear posed significant challenges. In some cases, elevated shoes or intricately decorated slippers were worn, limiting stability and requiring careful coordination. Even a minor misstep could result in injury, embarrassment, or the need for immediate adjustment, further amplifying physical and social pressure. The combination of hygiene, hairstyling, and clothing created a cumulative physical strain that was easy to underestimate. Noble brides might have the advantage of attendants to help with dressing, yet the process was lengthy and required stillness, focus, and tolerance of discomfort. Peasant brides, assisting themselves or aided by a small number of family members, endured similar challenges under less favorable conditions. In either case, preparation was both a literal and symbolic trial. It required resilience, patience, and the ability to present oneself according to societal expectations despite fatigue, physical discomfort, or anxiety. In addition to physical demands, preparation carried a psychological dimension. The bride was acutely aware that her appearance, demeanor, and comportment would be scrutinized by family, guests, and the groom himself. Hair askew, clothing misaligned, or posture deemed improper could be remembered and commented upon, sometimes with lasting social consequences. The process of preparing for the wedding was thus a delicate balance of personal endurance and social performance. Every gesture, every fold of fabric, and every carefully arranged hair strand was both a practical necessity and a signal of competence and virtue. Even religious and symbolic rituals compounded these pressures. Brides were often expected to participate in blessings, prayers, or rites of purification before the ceremony. These rituals, conducted in chapels or at home, demanded reverence and composure. The alignment of spiritual preparation with physical readiness reinforced the sense that the wedding was not merely a personal milestone, but a public, communal, and divine event. Failure to meet expectations, whether in appearance, posture, or attention to ritual, was not just socially risky, but spiritually significant. In practical terms, preparation also involved managing the logistics of the dowry, gifts, and ceremonial items. Each object, coins, textiles, jewelry, or livestock tokens needed to be accounted for, secured, and often displayed in a precise manner. Attending to these details required focus and coordination, further taxing the bride and her attendants. The weight of expectation extended beyond personal appearance to encompass family honor, financial responsibility, and long-term social standing. Even minor oversights carried consequences. A crooked belt, a wrinkled gown, or a misaligned veil could provoke subtle criticism, gossip, or anxiety. In a society that placed extraordinary importance on appearances and ritual compliance, the smallest lapse could be magnified. For the bride, preparation was thus a crucible, a prolonged period of endurance testing not only physical stamina but also composure, attention to detail, and resilience under observation. By the time the bride was finally ready to proceed to the ceremony, she had already endured hours of labor, discomfort, and psychological strain. Every aspect of preparation, from bathing to dress to symbolic ritual, was designed to test endurance, ensure compliance with social norms, and reinforce hierarchy. The visible beauty and poise that greeted guests at the ceremony was the culmination of effort, attention, and endurance, much of which remained unseen yet fundamentally shaped the trajectory of the wedding day. And so, as you imagine a bride standing in a hall layered in fabric, her hair braided and adorned, her feet aching from stiff shoes, and her mind alert to every expectation, one question lingers: could any bride truly maintain perfect composure, balance, and grace under such relentless demands? Or was exhaustion, subtle misstep, and anxiety an inevitable part of the preparation for a medieval wedding? By the time the bride moved from the private confines of her chamber into the public spaces of the wedding venue, the first stage of her ordeal had already left her physically weary and mentally alert. The ceremonial procession to the church or hall was itself a complex, exhausting ritual. Each step, each gesture, and each glance was laden with expectation. For noble brides, the procession often involved attendants carrying portions of her attire, ceremonial candles, or gift, while for peasant brides, family members provided guidance and support through narrow streets or uneven terrain. Even a short walk required careful attention, as the layers of heavy garments, stiff footwear, and veil restricted movement and made balance precarious. Ceremonial etiquette intensified the pressure. The bride's posture, hand placement, and pace were scrutinized by both family and onlookers. Any sign of discomfort, fatigue, or inattention could be interpreted as lack of virtue, poise, or respect. Standing for long periods during the ceremony demanded physical endurance. Kneeling, bowing, and repeated gestures added further strain, particularly when performed on hard stone floors or unyielding benches. Noble brides were expected to maintain a composed and graceful demeanor throughout, a feat that tested muscles, joints, and mental resilience. Religious rituals added a spiritual layer to the ordeal. Priests or officiants conducted blessings, prayers, and symbolic acts that reinforced the sanctity of the union. The bride had to respond with appropriate gestures, recitations, and expression, often while managing the weight and discomfort of ceremonial dress. Symbolic acts, such as the presentation of the dowry or ceremonial lighting of candles, required both precision and endurance. Missteps were not merely social faux pas. They could be interpreted as signs of unpreparedness, moral weakness, or inadequate training, magnifying stress under the watchful eyes of the congregation. Physical endurance extended beyond posture and movement. The ceremonial attire often restricted circulation and mobility, sometimes causing swelling, numbness, or fatigue. Veils and headdresses, sometimes reinforced with wire, or adorned with heavy ornament, pressed against the head and neck, creating discomfort that increased over hours. Tight bodices or corset-like garments limited breathing and placed additional pressure on the torso. Even the simplest tasks, lifting hands for blessings, adjusting a veil, or responding to a ritual cue, required deliberate effort. Every motion was scrutinized, making natural movement nearly impossible without awareness of perception. Social pressures were constant and unyielding. The bride's performance was a public demonstration of family competence, virtue, and status. Observers, friends, relatives, neighbors, and local dignitaries evaluated her every gesture and expression. A faint frown, an improperly clasped hand, or a misaligned garment could provoke subtle criticism, gossip, or lasting judgment. The bride's endurance was not solely physical. It was an ongoing negotiation with social expectation, requiring constant mental calculation and composure under observation. Communication during the ceremony presented its own challenges. Brides were expected to respond to vows, blessings, or questions with clarity and timeliness. Mispronunciation, hesitation, or failure to follow ritual cues could be interpreted as disrespect, incompetence, or a lack of spiritual preparation. In a period when literacy was limited and ritual knowledge was often learned through observation and repetition, mistakes were easy to make, adding layers of stress to an already taxing situation. Even the ceremonial movements around the wedding altar were exhausting. Kneeling, rising, turning, and walking in a choreographed sequence required coordination with both attendants and the officiant. Any misstep could disrupt the ritual, attract attention, or create embarrassment. In larger venues, uneven floors, crowded aisles, and the weight of ceremonial clothing increased the risk of slips or stumbles. The bride was constantly balancing the physical constraints of her garments with the symbolic precision demanded by ritual, a duality that magnified fatigue and heightened stress. Beyond the formal ceremony, the immediate post-ritual activities, receiving congratulations, participate in blessings, or attending to formal introductions, extended the endurance required. The bride was expected to interact with multiple guests in succession, demonstrate courtesy, gratitude, and composure despite hours of prior exertion. Each interaction reinforced the social and symbolic significance of the wedding, but also compounded exhaustion. The layering of physical, mental, and social strain created a subtle form of brutality, one that tested every aspect of a bride's stamina long before the feast or celebrations began. Historical accounts reveal the toll these rituals could take. Noble brides were sometimes observed fainting or needing brief rests during extended ceremonies, while attendants adjusted garments to allow temporary relief. Peasant brides, though less encumbered by luxurious fabrics, faced long walks to chapel or communal spaces, exposure to weather, and constant expectation of decorum. In all cases, endurance was a measure of both personal resilience and social competence. The successful bride was one who could navigate discomfort and scrutiny simultaneously, emerging with dignity and grace. Even the smallest ceremonial gestures carried significance. The positioning of hands, the tilt of the head, or the pace of walking down an aisle signaled attention to propriety and respect for hierarchy. Guests interpreted these subtleties as evidence of training, virtue, and family guidance. Mistakes, even minor, could be magnified in memory and retold in social circles, influencing perceptions of both the bride and her household. In essence, the wedding ceremony was as much a test of endurance and attention as it was a celebration of union. As the ceremony concluded and the bride prepared to transition to the post-ceremony feast, one question lingered. Given the cumulative weight of physical, social, and symbolic demands, could any bride truly maintain grace, alertness, and composure throughout the entire process, or was exhaustion and subtle error an inevitable part of the medieval wedding experience? When the ceremony finally ended and the bride stepped away from the altar, one might assume that her ordeal had concluded. In reality, the aftermath of the wedding often extended the subtle brutality she had endured throughout the day, transitioning from the formal ritual to the public celebration. The feast, dances, and post-ceremony obligations required continued endurance, both physical and social. The bride's body, still constrained by multiple layers of heavy clothing and tight accessories, bore the marks of prolonged exertion, while her mind remained acutely attuned to social expectation. The immediate post-ceremony period was a delicate balancing act. Noble brides, escorted by attendants, often had to present themselves to multiple groups of guests, receiving congratulations, gifts, and formal blessings. Each interaction demanded composure, attentiveness, and tact. Peasant brides faced similar challenges on a smaller scale: acknowledgement of neighbors, management of dowry items, and participation in local rituals. For all brides, these engagements came at a time when exhaustion was at its peak, highlighting the physical and psychological strain inherent in medieval nuptial practice. Feasts that followed were as much a continuation of ceremony as a celebration. While guests were seated, food served, and entertainment performed, the bride's attention remained divided. She was expected to navigate the hall with poise, interact appropriately with each guest, and participate in ritualized actions such as toasts, dances, or ceremonial gift exchanges. Physical fatigue, compounded by restricted clothing, made standing, walking, and sitting difficult, while social vigilance required constant mental engagement. Historical accounts often note brides who appeared pale or weary but maintained composure, evidence of endurance becoming a form of social performance itself. Long-term consequences of these demands were subtle but significant. A bride's ability to endure and manage the pressures of preparation, ceremony, and post-ceremony engagements influenced her household's reputation. Success could enhance her standing, reflecting well on her family and solidifying social bonds. Failure, or even minor lapses, could prompt gossip, subtle criticism, or diminished status in the eyes of both local communities and distant relations. Social memory in medieval communities was remarkably persistent. The impressions formed during weddings could shape alliances, negotiations, and perceptions of competence for years. Physical after-effects were also common. Extended periods in restrictive attire, high heels, or stiff fabrics could result in bruising, sore muscles, or even fainting. Brides often reported discomfort from veils, corsets, or ceremonial footwear, sometimes exacerbated by long walks, dancing, or repeated ritual movements. The careful coordination required to avoid mishaps meant that even brief relief was difficult to find, and the body's fatigue accumulated unnoticed until the event concluded. This cumulative strain underscores the often overlooked endurance demanded by medieval weddings. Social dynamics did not simply vanish once the ceremony ended. Guest judgments, interactions, and observations remained part of the communal record. Attendants and family members also faced continued expectations, proper distribution of leftover gifts, management of ceremonial items, and reconciliation of any disputes or grievances that arose during the day. Weddings, therefore, were not isolated events but extensions of the social, economic, and political fabric of medieval life. The bride's performance and endurance were central to this interconnected network of obligation. Dowries and ceremonial gifts required meticulous attention. Items had to be accounted for, displayed, and secured. Improper management, whether a misplaced coin, damaged textile, or forgotten ornament, could provoke social embarrassment or conflict. For noble households, mismanagement could even have legal consequences. As dowries and inheritance arrangements were often formally documented, the bride, as the custodian of these responsibilities, bore a significant share of pressure, linking her endurance not only to social perception, but to tangible economic and legal consequences. Beyond the immediate logistics, psychological stress lingered. A bride had to process every glance, comment, and subtle reaction from guests, internalizing praise, criticism, or silent judgment. The cognitive load of managing impression, composure, and obedience to ritual reinforced the notion that medieval weddings were tests of both mind and body. The ability to navigate these pressures successfully was considered a reflection of virtue, strength, and capability, yet it was achieved through prolonged, often invisible exertion. Even days after the wedding, the effects of these demands could persist. Brides often needed rest, recovery, and assistance in managing clothing, gifts, or household arrangements. Families discussed the success or failures of the event, negotiating perception and consequences that would affect future social and economic interactions. The endurance required for a medieval wedding was thus not confined to a single day, but extended into subsequent weeks, influencing both personal and family fortunes. The broader lesson of these experiences is clear. Medieval weddings were simultaneously celebrations, tests, and performances. The bride's preparation, ceremonial conduct, and post-ceremony obligations reveal a hidden form of brutality, not physical violence in the conventional sense, but endurance demanded by social expectation, hierarchy, and ritual. Her resilience, composure, and attention to detail were critical to the perceived success of the event, shaping social networks, alliances, and reputations in profound ways. In retrospect, the enduring impact of these practices raises a question. In a society where every gesture, garment, and glance carried weight, was the success of a wedding determined by joy and celebration, or by the bride's and her attendants' ability to endure exhaustion, discomfort, and relentless social scrutiny? And if the latter is true, what does that reveal about the hidden labor, resilience, and subtle endurance that underpin the rituals of medieval life? At first glance, a medieval wedding might appear as a simple celebration, a gathering of family and neighbors, a ceremony in the church, followed by a feast. Yet, beneath the surface, every wedding was an intricate web of economic calculation, negotiation, and obligation. The financial demands were substantial, often rivaling or exceeding the physical and social pressures already placed on the bride, groom, and their families. Understanding the economics of medieval weddings reveals a hidden brutality, one that combined meticulous planning, negotiation, and the risk of long-term consequences. The first consideration in most medieval marriages was the dowry, a collection of wealth, property, or goods provided by the bride's family. Dowries varied dramatically depending on social status, region, and family fortune. Among the nobility, dowries could include land, livestock, textiles, jewelry, or substantial sums of coin. For peasants and townspeople, the dowry was often composed of livestock, tool, or household goods items that represented significant labor and savings. These contributions were not merely symbolic. They were legally binding and served as both an investment in the couple's future and a demonstration of family wealth and status. Failure to meet dowry expectations could delay marriage negotiations, provoke disputes, or diminish social standing. Negotiating the dowry was a delicate process. Families often engaged in extended discussions to determine the appropriate value, composition, and timing of delivery. Contracts might be drawn up, witnessed, and notarized, ensuring that obligations were legally enforceable. Misunderstandings, ambiguous wording, or delayed payments could lead to long-lasting disputes, sometimes involving courts, neighbors, or local authorities. Even seemingly minor disagreements such as the precise quality of linens or the number of livestock included carried weight, influencing social reputation and familial alliances. Beyond the dowry, families bore additional expenses associated with the wedding itself. Food, drink, and entertainment were central components, and providing for large numbers of guests could be costly. Feasts required not only the procurement of ingredients but also the labor to prepare, cook, and serve them. Wealthy families might hire professional cooks, servers, or musicians, while smaller households relied on extended kin and neighbors. Regardless of scale, feeding even a modest gathering involved significant expense and coordination. Overindulgence or mismanagement could deplete household reserves, leaving families vulnerable in the weeks or months following the wedding. Clothing and ceremonial items were another substantial cost. The bride's attire, often the most scrutinized aspect of preparation, could include multiple layers of high-quality fabric, jewelry, veils, and shoes. The groom's garments, while sometimes less elaborate, also needed to reflect status and competence. In noble households, attire often showcased wealth, reinforcing social position and signaling alliances. For commoners, clothing might be simpler but still required careful investment to meet expectations and avoid social embarrassment. In either case, attire represented both financial and symbolic capital, with the potential for lasting impact on social perception. Gifts exchanged between families, friends, and patrons further increased economic demands. These were not merely gestures of goodwill, they were part of a complex system of obligation, reciprocity, and social signaling. Failing to provide appropriate gifts could be interpreted as disrespect, ingratitude, or lack of competence. While lavish gifts reinforced alliances and demonstrated wealth, tracking, delivering, and accounting for these exchanges required careful planning and sometimes months of preparation, adding another layer of pressure to an already taxing event. The economic burden extended beyond the wedding day. Dowries and gifts represented investments in the couple's future, and their management could affect inheritance, household stability, and even community relationships. A poorly executed wedding, whether through financial mismanagement, insufficient preparation, or failure to meet social expectations, could have long-term repercussions. Families might face criticism, weakened alliances, or disputes over property and obligation. The financial dimension of weddings was thus inseparable from social, legal, and political concerns. For the bride and groom themselves, the stakes were significant. Successful management of dowry items, gifts, and ceremonial obligations demonstrated competence, foresight, and reliability. Failure could damage reputations, strain family relationships, and limit future opportunities. Even beyond immediate social networks, chroniclers and neighbors often remembered economic missteps, weaving them into the social memory that shaped future negotiations, marriages, and community dynamics. Regional and temporal variations influenced the economic landscape. In some areas, communal expectations dictated elaborate displays of wealth, while in others, modesty and restraint were valued. Economic conditions, harvest yields, local markets, or broader political instability could also affect a family's ability to meet obligations. Historical accounts reveal that families sometimes delayed weddings, adjusted dowries, or negotiated alternative arrangements in response to these pressures. The financial demands of a wedding were dynamic, shaped by circumstance, and often unpredictable. Even small households faced complex calculations, determining the number of guests to invite, how much food to provide, and how to allocate labor required careful planning. A misjudgment could result in shortage, waste, or embarrassment. Once the initial preparations were underway, the true complexity of a medieval wedding's economic dimension began to emerge. Families were no longer simply gathering goods and arranging garments, they were negotiating, coordinating, and reconciling multiple streams of obligation, each with the potential to disrupt both social harmony and household stability. For many households, particularly those of modest means, this stage revealed the subtle yet relentless brutality of marriage as an economic enterprise. Negotiations over the dowry were often the most protracted and contentious aspect. While agreements might be formalized months or even years in advance, the details remained subject to revision. Families debated the precise value of property, the number of livestock or garments to be included, and the timing of delivery. Historical records from the 14th and 15th centuries indicate disputes over whether a dowry should include liquid assets, land that might be used for cultivation, or specific items of clothing or jewelry. These negotiations were not trivial. Each adjustment carried both immediate financial consequences and potential reputational impact. Families perceived as stingy or indecisive risked diminished standing in their community. While overly generous offers could strain household resources for years, financial crises were a common occurrence. Unforeseen expenses such as a sudden increase in the cost of grain, a last-minute requirement for new clothing, or the need to hire additional servants or musicians could quickly escalate a household's financial burden. Noble families might offset these costs through loans, barter, or the sale of assets. But even small households often faced hard choices, inviting fewer guests, reducing the quantity or quality of food, or reallocating labor from other essential tasks. Each decision carried social implications. Guests could perceive frugality as disrespect or inadequacy, while excessive spending risked financial collapse. Balancing these pressures required acute judgment and careful negotiation. The logistics of the wedding feast added further strain. The scale of food preparation, especially for larger households, was staggering. Procuring meat, grain, and ale or wine for wealthier families demanded careful calculation to avoid both shortage and waste. Spices, imported foods, and delicacies were particularly expensive, often reserved for special occasions like weddings. Mistiming deliveries or misjudging quantities could result in shortages which not only embarrassed the hosts but could provoke tension among guests. In some cases, chroniclers noted disputes erupting during feasts over perceived inequities in seating, portions, or attention from hosts. These incidents illustrate how economic mismanagement could directly affect social relationships. Dowry delivery, particularly when it involved land or property, introduced additional complexity. Legal arrangements often required formal documentation, witnesses, or even intervention from local authorities. Errors in recording transactions could lead to long-term disputes, including contested ownership or inheritance issues. In regions governed by strict feudal or civic law, the failure to deliver dowry items properly could spark legal action, social censure, or the involvement of neighboring authorities. Even when families acted in good faith, misunderstandings or delayed deliveries were common, creating a persistent source of tension. Gifts exchanged between families and guests were another source of both expense and social negotiation. Wealthy households might offer ornate jewelry, textiles, or rare items, while smaller households contributed practical goods such as livestock or tools. The exchange of gifts was never purely ceremonial. It reflected social hierarchies, demonstrated loyalty, and reinforced alliances. Improperly calculated gifts, either insufficient or excessively lavish, could disrupt relationships, generate gossip. In essence, every tangible item carried social weight, linking the economic dimension of the wedding to long-term social perception. Debt was an inevitable risk for many families. Loans taken to cover wedding expenses had to be repaid, sometimes with interest or additional obligations. Nobles, merchants, and even some peasant households were drawn into cycles of borrowing and repayment to fund feasts, clothing, or gifts. Chroniclers occasionally recount families remaining in debt for months or years after a wedding, a subtle reminder that the celebration was inseparable from practical economic management. The cost of marriage extended far beyond the ceremony, leaving lasting impacts on household stability and resilience. Economic pressures also influenced social interactions during the wedding itself. Families might restrict invitations, carefully choose seating arrangements, or allocate resources in ways that reflected both financial capacity and social strategy. Guests observed and evaluated these decisions, reading them as signals of status, wealth, and competence. Misjudging the scale or allocation of resources could provoke subtle criticism, erode trust, or complicate future alliances. In this sense, the wedding became a continuous negotiation between economics and social perception, a balancing act with no true endpoint until debts were settled and social obligations were fully reconciled. The consequences of economic mismanagement were particularly evident in post-wedding memory. Families remembered shortfalls, disputes, or acts of generosity, and the recollections influenced future negotiations, alliances, and marriages. Chroniclers noted that even small errors such as failing to provide enough servants, neglecting to properly deliver dowry items, or miscalculating portions for a feast could echo for years, shaping the reputation of both bride and groom's families. Social memory, intertwined with economic performance, created a subtle yet enduring form of pressure that extended far beyond the wedding day. By the time the bride and groom settled into their new household, the full weight of economic reality was clear. They were custodians of dowry property, responsible for managing ongoing obligations, and often burdened with debt incurred to ensure the wedding met social expectations. Their endurance had been tested not only by ceremonial performance and physical strain, but also by meticulous financial management and negotiation. The hidden brutality of medieval weddings lay not only in labor and ceremony, but also in the relentless scrutiny, economic calculation, and long-term consequences that accompanied every decision. As you consider the layers of negotiation, the precarious balance of resources, and the enduring consequence of miscalculated generosity or oversight, one question arises: in a society where every coin, gift, and agreement carried weight, was financial strain an unavoidable companion of marriage, or could any family truly navigate the economic landscape of a medieval wedding without compromise or consequence?